Previously on the backside of water.
Wow. Well, speaking of safety, it's also kind of interesting to note that for the first couple of years of the operation, the teacups had no brakes either.
The Mad Tea Party has become such an iconic part of the Disney park canon that 5 of the 6 Disney parks modeled after Disneyland worldwide have a teacup attraction, with all 5 of them being located in Fantasyland.
Make sure your fanny pack is stuffed with the 3 essential items.
Wait, who could that be? I'm Henry Hannibal Highbrow of the International Purist Advisory Council. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. What? Why? Sir, according to the bylaws of the IPAC, a quote-unquote huge fan that has professed being a quote-unquote huge fan of the family amusement enterprise of Disneyland Park is required to have ridden every ride and attraction within the berm walls of said enterprise. Wait, is this serious? I'm afraid it's serious enough that you will have to come with me, sir. Annie, help!
Al, I'm coming.
Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrows. And to make matters worse, I don't even know the rest of the words to this song.
Let's see what the followers of your blog think when you write to them from this dingy old cell.
Oof.
Hey, friend. What are you in for?
They claim I violated some international fandom law of some sort.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I host a blog about how I'm M. Night Shyamalan's biggest fan, even though I haven't seen Lady in the Water or Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Brought up on the old purist charge, huh? Me too. Honestly, I thought this whole IPAC thing was a bunch of nonsense, but as they walked me in, I caught a glimpse of this building, pal, and it is huge. I actually heard it was built with funds from fines collected during the 2003 Death Cab for Cutie class action suit filed against the world of supposed indie music fans. What are you doing?
Checking to see if the guard is gone. Seems like the coast is clear. I can finally take this ratty beard off. Ugh.
Annie? Is that you? Man, that was an awesome disguise. That whole time, I thought you were a middle-aged dude who was really into The Sixth Sense. How did you get in here?
Al, there's no time to explain, okay? The guard will be back any minute, and he'll come to check on us, so we need to get out of here.
I'll stop you there, Annie. I've checked every inch of this cell, and there's no way out.
When the door is closed, sometimes it's necessary to make a window.
Annie, is that what I think it is?
Yep. Military-grade plastic explosives.
How did you get your hands on that?
Al, again, no time to explain, okay? The wall over there seems to be a good candidate, though. Hurry, flip over the bed.
Wow, that was impressive.
Hopefully, it was impressive enough to get the guard's attention.
What is that sound?
Oh no, not again! We got a breach in holding cell 9. I repeat, breach in a holding cell.
Annie, you just karate chopped both guards in the neck at the same time.
Trust me, he didn't feel a thing. I was able to knock him out using an ancient Cambodian trick I learned while in the service.
Service?
Ow! No time to explain! Quick, we need to put their uniforms on, okay? Now. There. Okay. Then we're just gonna stroll out.
Ah, clever little bit of misdirection there, Anne.
Thanks. I learned it from an episode of 8 is Enough. Quick, through those doors. There. I think... Oof!
Going somewhere?
Dr. Spencer Goldman. I should have known you'd be behind this.
Did you think you would really get away with hosting a podcast where you claim to be, quote, super fans, even though you haven't even ridden all of the attraction in the park you claim to be a fan of?
Goldman, you know that's not what being a super fan is all about.
You don't have to convince me. You just have to convince this army of superiority bots. Get them.
Forwards!
Annie, what are we gonna do?
I don't know, Al. Those robots look really unforgiving.
Wait, I've got an idea.
Ow, don't turn around. They'll get you.
Hey, bots! I just caught wind that your beloved Spencer Goldman back there claims to be the world's biggest James Bond fan. Yet a tweet from his account on December 18th of 2009 claims that the Peter Sellers version of Casino Royale should be considered canon.
Ow, the bots, they're turning around.
I'll get you too if it's the last thing I do.
That should hold them off until we get out of here. There's the exit.
Is that really true about Goldman?
Annie, I have no idea. I just know that those bots attack first and think later. By the time they realize there's no tweet, we're going to be long gone.
Great thinking, Al.
And thank you, Annie. If you hadn't have broken me out of that cell, I don't even know what would have happened to me.
Oh, Al, it's the least I could do. No one is going to stop us from sharing the rich history, awesome stories, and fascinating details behind our favorite Disney attractions. Not even Dr. Spencer Goldman. Now, let's get back to the studio.
Hello, all, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Backside of Water. I'm Alex Stewart.
And I'm Annie Rugit, and I'm not exactly sure how that opening sketch plays into today's episode, other than the fact that Al hasn't ridden the attraction that is at the heart of this episode, Casey Jr. Circus Trains.
Annie, I'm offended. That sketch has everything to do with Casey Jr. I gotta say, personally, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it all connects, but I'm sure it does. But in the meantime, let's cover the topic at hand. The attraction to this day I have never ridden, the original, the charming, the actually really cool Casey Jr. Circus Trains. Through our research on this attraction, I have grown to love this little choo-choo located smack in the middle of Fantasyland.
The story behind the opening of this attraction is truly a great one, so let's not waste any time getting into the story of Casey Jr.
It was hot. Really hot. July 14th, 1955. 3 days before Walt Disney's new theme park was set to open, and all of Fantasyland was bustling with workers making last-minute touch-ups on carousel horses, painting facades, tightening screws that held flying elephants in place, testing magical teacups, and firing up the engines on the Casey Jr. Circus Train. Based on the train bearing the same name from the 1941 Disney classic film Dumbo, this attraction was set to open with the rest of the park on the 17th of that month. That is, as long as it tested well on its final days of adjustment. Tensions were high around the park for everything to be perfect and finalized for the opening day that was to consist mostly of press people to see the theme park that many were considering Walt's latest folly. The eyes of the world were on the park, as well as its work schedule, as Walt had told the world he would be able to open his park in a year from the breaking of ground back in 1954, and he didn't want to be made into a liar.
That tension was certainly felt on the rolling hills that overlooked Fantasyland. This space had been reserved for Casey Jr. all along. Walt's obsession with the trains would not only surround the park, but it would also be housed within its favorite part of the park, Fantasyland. Walt had enlisted Aero Development to work on this little locomotive that could. Aero engineers settled on a design that mirrored the look of the train in the film. It was a very animated shape that caused some in the engineering team to question if it could actually work in a real-world application like this. Nonetheless, they moved forward into the fabrication of the train design.
The WED team walked the track on the attraction to make sure everything was in place before the maiden voyage of Casey Jr. The train would run on a 2-foot narrow-gauge track. The engineers couldn't help but notice that the track was running over some fairly barren-looking ground. Now, the attraction wasn't filled with vibrant set pieces or ornate figures to leave guests in awe. In fact, the grounds around the track wasn't even very well landscaped. There weren't a lot of trees, bushes, or various other greenery around the track.
It was understood that there would eventually be a canal boat attraction built amongst the track that would provide more for guests to look at. But really, it wasn't the landscape that was to be the focus of their attention. No, the focus would be on the train itself. After ensuring everything was in order on the track, it was time to inspect the main attraction itself, the train.
With the sun rising higher in the Southern California sky, the engineers then inspected each car of the train. They needed to inspect both trains that were built for the attraction, the number 7 and the number 9. Each train was identical. The engineers first inspected the locomotive car that would traditionally house the engine for the train, but Casey Jr. was different. The train itself was powered by an internal combustion engine, but this locomotive car was much too small to be able to house an engine large enough to pull the full weight of the train and its guests as well, due to its cartoonish nature. So WED and Aero designers decided to create a little Disney magic by pulling a switcheroo and placing the vehicle's engine inside the next car to be inspected, the large Calliope car.
The Calliope was positioned just behind the engine car. The team started up the engine and the rumble rang out clear and true. The engineer looked down and admired the wheels, black as coal. These wheels would be the only thing that gave away the fact that the Calliope housed the engine instead of the locomotive, as all the other cars' wheels were a robin's egg blue. While in the Calliope, they also engaged the air compression system that provided the necessary braking for the train so it wouldn't become a runaway train attraction. It also provided the necessary air compression for that charming little horn that would ring out every time old Casey began his junior. Of course, this whistle would have to be tested as well. The WED engineer took hold of the whistle handle and gave it its little inaugural toot-toot.
The inspection then moved to the first passenger car, a pink chair car that was open air for guests to take in the mild weather provided by Anaheim's climate. The engineer was flooded with memories about the origins of this chair and the other open-air passenger chair of the train. Contrary to popular belief, Disneyland wasn't built using a large pile of money. In fact, budgets were fairly tight, and the Casey Jr.'s budget was no exception. So Imagineers had to get creative in order to complete some of these projects with the money that they were given. The Casey Jr. team began thinking about options when one of them suggested that the seats from Walt Disney's newly purchased carousel could be used. It was understood that Walt only wanted jumper horses on the carousel, so everything else was being tossed to make way for the galloping stampede. This included the traditional bench-style seating that was provided on many carousels of the time. Instead of throwing the seats out, the Casey Jr. team decided it would be a good idea financially to give the seats a new purpose. They refurbished the seats, slapped a new coat of paint on them, added some flourishes here and there, and voila! The train had its open-air cars.
The inspection then led the engineer past the monkey and wild animal cage car that would be sure to be a favorite amongst the kids, as it would make them feel like a ferocious animal in need of caging. He would pass by the other open-air car, and then, finally, the small caboose.
With the track and train inspections complete, it was time to take Casey Jr. in on its first run down the track. Helmed by legendary Imagineer Roger Broggie, the train began to lurch forward. The music track kicked in just as it should have. It was Casey Jr.'s theme song from the film penned by Frank Churchill and Ned Washington. These two were also responsible for writing the music for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Pinocchio.
Everything was going off without a hitch. The train ran smooth as butter across the brand new track. The engine was strong and steady. The music rang out for all to hear. Then, the train approached its first hill. The hill was fairly steep, built at a 25% grade. This hill was to replicate the large hill Casey Jr. encounters in the film that causes him to doubt his own abilities of train pullery. As he huffs up the hill in the film, he puffs out the now famous words, "I think I can. I think I can." But Broggie had no idea how difficult this hill would prove to be for the little engine. As the train began to climb the hill, something began to feel off. Really off. Broggy didn't know exactly what felt strange, but he knew there was something wrong, and the problem was very quickly becoming apparent.
Once the train reached the halfway point up the steep hill, the locomotive began to tip backwards over itself. This was a disaster. Broggy panicked as he watched the train's wheel lift up off the track. Suddenly, a very large construction worker, who was watching the whole thing, raced to the rescue and managed to weigh the locomotive down. Broggy and the construction worker were able to get the train stopped, and thankfully no one was hurt. But this incident seemed to spell certain doom for Casey Jr. Not only was the attraction prevented from opening with the rest of the park on July 17th, but some weren't even sure if it would ever open in its current design.
The WED team, along with the other folks at Aero Development, sat down and talked about what caused that little locomotive to tip backwards. They realized after much debate that the design of the locomotive, though very faithful to the film version, simply didn't work in the real world. Modifications were needed. Members from both WED and Aero worked around the clock trying to solve the Casey Jr. conundrum. It seemed like the problem was impossible to figure out until someone mentioned a very simple solution: weights and balance. It was suggested that the little locomotive be weighed down with lead weights. To evenly distribute the new balance, the operator of the locomotive would also need to lean back as the train climbed the hill. They seemed to think it was too easy of a solution, but the team decided with their time constraints to give it a try.
The weights were added to the locomotive, and the operator was given the directions to lean back during the rise of the crest. Tensions were high the day the team first tested the new design. The train went around the track with no problem, but as it approached the steep incline, the engineering team held their breath. Casey Jr. began to slowly climb the steep hill. It climbed and climbed, seeming as though nothing could get in its way. When it reached the middle point, the operator leaned back as though his life depended on it, just as it hit the point where it had previously tipped backwards. But nothing happened. The train continued to climb the hill, undaunted by its steep grade. Casey Jr. had overcome the hill.
The ride opened on July 31st, 1955 to great fanfare. Guests loved the quaint charm that Casey Jr. provided. Though it seemed like sure disaster, WED and Aero had taken the obstacle and found a solution. This partnership would endure as Aero went on to design many of the other attractions we know and love in Disneyland.
Over the years, the storybook canal boats would be built around Casey Jr., providing folks with a bird's eye view of some of the most iconic locales in the Disney movies. But outside of this addition, Casey Jr.'s Circus Train has seen very little changes. It is basically the same charming train folks rode all the way back in the summer of 1955.
People's love of this little engine that could even spawned a new attraction in Disneyland Paris based off this little tenacious train. The Parisian version is a more high-paced roller coaster, but the charm of the original Casey Jr. is still apparent in the design. And honestly, that's the story of Casey Jr. I personally loved the way that this story was framed because all of it was true. I mean, that whole tipping backwards portion was nothing that could be made up in this situation. That seems like that would be a very terrifying experience to be part of as the engineer.
Yes, and I love the idea of this construction worker going and weighing down the train and kind of knowing what to do, and then that leading to a solution for the train of using weights.
Absolutely.
Very
Absolutely.
cool.
Mm-hmm. It's a very cool story. And one thing that I do want to focus at towards the end of this episode is the conversation that started this entire thing out. I haven't ridden it. I've never ridden Casey Jr. And obviously, because of this episode, I will now go and make a point to ride that attraction, which is kind of the focus of this podcast. It's intended for people to maybe dive into some of the attractions that they've never gone on before or had interest in simply because they learned some new things about it. Personally, for me, that's exactly what I'm going to do on this. But the reason why I bring this up is because everybody I've ever talked to about Casey Jr. says the same thing. Don't waste your time. Have you ever ridden on this before, Annie?
Yeah, I have. I have pictures of me with my sisters when I was probably 4 or 5.
Oh, cute.
Yeah, real cute on Casey Jr. It's, it's a cool ride for kids because it is really whimsical and cartoonish, and it's tiny. When you go on it as an adult, it's like, oh gosh, how am I going to fit in there? You have to do some gymnastics. It's a little uncomfortable. But that's kind of a cool element for kids, is it feels like it's the right size for them. And I think that's really special to have in Disneyland.
I could see that for sure. Have you ridden on it lately, though?
I did not go this last time around, but I did go on it with my sister earlier last year, and we enjoyed it. We enjoyed it enough. I noticed how small it was then.
Yeah, it probably became very apparent.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's probably just never going to be... it's going to be one of those rides that adults just won't like as much, but I think kids will still really enjoy. Like, it's just not quite an even balance like most of the other rides are.
I could see that. Well, and one thing that I kind of question is... And again, I'm not making a judgment call here, but what I guess I'm bringing up is I'm surprised that this attraction has endured as long as it has. The line is never very long. Nobody really ever talks about it. And I don't feel like it's as iconic as the rest of the attractions in Fantasyland. I mean, even the smaller dark rides, the Snow Whites, the Pinocchios, even outshine in popularity the appeal that Casey Jr. has. In fact, I was looking online at some different various reviewing aggregate websites, and some of these things say that it pulls in a 71% user recommendation, which means that 70% of people recommend that you ride on Casey Jr., which seems pretty awesome, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, 70%, that's pretty good. It's the lowest recommended attraction in all Disneyland.
Wow.
Which is crazy. I mean, think about it. There are some attractions in this park that are less than stellar, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That I think would be lower than a 70% in the awesome factor. But that's a pretty telling statement to know that Casey Jr. Circus Train is the least recommended attraction in all of Disneyland Park.
Well, yeah, it kind of blows my mind, but also, like we were talking about, it being kind of a smaller ride that's also not that long. Like the larger trains that go around the circumference of the park are longer. It's a longer duration. It's kind of like, as a parent, it's neither long. You don't really get to rest that long with your kids, like you do in Small World and stuff. And it's really small. So I get why parents are probably like not that into it, and adults are not that into it. And they're the ones who are doing the reviews online, is what I'm trying to say.
But I think that makes sense.
I think maybe it stayed because kids generally really like it still. Like, it's not, I don't know, and it's a classic. I just have, do you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah,
kinda?
I could see what you're saying, that the magic is lost on parents, but it still could exist within the hearts of kids.
Yeah, like maybe parents are less inclined to wait in line for it, so it doesn't have that long of a line. But I mean, if I was an inspector going around to the rides throughout Disneyland, like, kids probably just still love Casey Jr. I don't know. It doesn't take up a lot of space because it kind of goes around within the other rides.
Well, I think it's really interesting because with this, you've got the steam trains that circle the entire park, like you said. Mm-hmm. And I guess that my thought is, why not just have the steam trains? Why is Casey Jr. necessary? I mean, obviously that's a dark, humbuggy way to think about this. But realistically, if you can ride the steam trains, which are, I mean, in scale and scope, pretty superior.
Yes, but I remember as a kid, the steam trains were not magical to me.
Interesting.
But Casey Jr. was magical.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe because
What do you think it was?
I think it was colorful and it was tiny and it kind of looked like a circus train rather than the steam trains look really industrial. Yeah, I can't recall absolutely loving it, but I had a lot of fun. I liked being in the wild animal car cage.
Well, I think that's one of the big things that a lot of kids love. And I think that's a really good point that too often we as fans, especially myself included, only see Disney through my own eyes. And as such, I even tailor that experience for my own kids. And that's why on this next go-around, when we go in March of this year, 2019, I am going to take my kids on this ride and see what they think, because I don't want them to love the Disneyland I love. I want them to love the Disneyland that they love. And as you just said right there, the steam trains may not have the same magical effect that Casey Jr. does on them. So I'll be really curious, and I'm going to reserve my judgment for it until I go on it, because clearly I have nothing to work from other than all of these reviews that I see online, which is still, I think, a very valid and interesting conversation to have, that nobody recommends it. The biggest things that they say is it's slow, it's dull, it's boring. And people get really irritated that it closes during rainy times. So
No, that's when you want to ride it.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing that's so bizarre to me, is I'm just like, man, I've never seen a Disney attraction that's garnered so much dislike. Now, I will say that Toontown as a whole has garnered as much dissatisfaction, but it's an entire wing of the park, and I cannot wait to talk about Toontown on this podcast, because I think that it'll be our first real step into the fingerprint that Michael Eisner left on the park. And not being an ultra mega Disney nerd, Annie, I'm probably pretty confident that you don't know much behind the Michael Eisner saga, right?
Not as much as you know, by any means.
Well,
because you are the Disney nerd. I love it.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
can't
it
wait
is
to
absolutely fascinating. Fascinating stuff that I'm looking forward to. But this is a different area. And so I hope that with this new release of Dumbo that's coming out, again, in the podcasting world, these things can be on here for years. And so the thing that we talk about here, obviously, for some listeners, has already happened a long time ago. But as of the recording of this podcast, they are rebooting Dumbo into a live-action series, or live-action film, excuse me. And so I will be very curious to see if Disney does anything to Casey Jr. There's no doubt in my mind that the Dumbo attraction, the flying elephants, will have something changed, but I'll be curious to see if they do anything with Casey Jr., you know?
Oh gosh. Yeah. They could make it into like a scary Isn't the new new Dumbo
Tim
looks
Burton came in.
I like a Tim Burton new scary. You go in, I don't know, VR.
I'm really curious to see it. I'm very curious to see it. And again, what I'm really wondering is, will they keep Casey Jr. for the long haul? Can I expect my grandkids to ride Casey Jr., or will it be replaced? Because I would put, from my perspective, I would put money on the fact that Casey Jr. is going to be gone in the near future, because real estate is.
I don't like that money being put on it. I'm a fan of
but
Casey
here's what
Jr.
I'll say is, and here's what I'll say is, putting my money on it doesn't also reflect my appreciation for the attraction either. What I'm saying is, I see the way that the Disney park has continued to grow and change in the last decade or so. And when it comes to things like Galaxy's Edge that's coming in, and the way that they're moving the direction of the park, I could see them going for a more refreshed and updated intellectual property to focus on in that area, instead of Casey Jr., because Dumbo is already represented in the park. This is obviously me going into speculation, but That's why I would say that I would put my money, not my happiness, but I would put if I was a betting man, I would put my money on the fact that Casey Jr.'s days are definitely numbered.
Yeah, well, and you have a really good sense for this. I think you definitely do, like, because you follow what shifts are happening in the park and you know, learning the history and stuff. You probably have a keen sense to when they're ready to kind of refresh areas. So, you know, we'll see. I'll have to keep that in my mind, though, so I can congratulate you or, you know.
Oh, I wouldn't want any congratulations.
Twiddle my fingers in your face.
Because
doesn't happen.
And again, I would imagine that in the 60s, people would probably be like, old hat. In the 70s, they're like, oh, Casey Jr., old hat. 80s, same, 90s. But for some reason, there's something magical that endured. Whether it is something that really appeals to the kids or it's Disney saying, bottom line is it's cheap to operate and we can't really do anything else with that space around storybook for now. So until that happens, Casey Jr.'s coming down the track.
Yes.
So in light of that, I would say let's wrap this whole thing up, Annie. What do you say?
Yeah, I think let's do this thing. Casey Jr. is a shining testament to the fact that you can overcome any obstacle in your way as long as you set your mind to it. The little train just chugs its way up the upper reaches of Fantasyland, reminding us of hard work, creativity, and ingenuity that countless men and women have put in over the years, creating the happiest place on earth. So next time you're in the park, keep an ear out for that little whistle blow and let it remind you of all those who helped make this place what it is today.
If you like this episode of The Backside of Water, please consider leaving us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, Did You Know Disney, where we explore every story within the Disney universe. You can find that show wherever you found the old Backside of Water here.
And also be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for the Backside of Water podcast.
Now, as you exit, please watch your head and watch your step.
And if you happen to miss your step and hit your head, please watch your language. Goodbye.